Well, thank you for coming today. It's a little bit early where I am. I've been in Australia due to the COVID crisis. And we're here today to celebrate AccessibilityOz's 10th birthday. I wanted to start the presentation by showing you a mug that I got created for the launch party. I'm not sure if you can see it. Hold on. Little AccessibilityOz logo. Logo hasn't really changed in 10 years, but we have, changed a few things. So today we're going to talk about the history of web accessibility. I myself have been in the industry for a long time, 23 years, and of course running AccessibilityOz for 10 years. And so that's going to take up, say, the first half an hour. And then we've got some questions that were submitted. If we have time, we can also answer some more questions as well. So not necessarily on the history of web accessibility, but any questions that you might have about accessibility. Excellent. So starting with the history of web accessibility, as I said, I've been in the industry for a while, but it started before I got involved. So there might be a few things that I don't know a whole lot about, and I do apologise for any errors. They are mine and mine alone. The first thing that really happened was in 1995, the Unified Website Accessibility Guidelines were released. Now, these were compiled by Greg van der Heijden, and he was actually the chair of the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group for many years when I was on the working group in the 2000s. And basically, they were created as a response to the second World Wide Web conference. Tim Berners-Lee, who of course founded the World Wide Web, he went to a pre-conference workshop on accessibility by Mike Paciello, who runs the Paciello Group, or used to run the Paciello Group, also now known as TPG. And he mentioned disability access at his keynote. So basically, these unified website accessibility guidelines were created by people who worked in the industry, and version 8 was released in 1998. So they had quite a lot of versions in those 3 years. And that was the starting point for WCAG 1. Now, in 1998, a number of things happened. Firstly, 1997, the Web Accessibility Initiative from the W3C was formed, and they started working on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The other thing that is really interesting is in 1998, Bill Clinton signed into law the Workforce Investment Act, which is basically the Section 508 amendment, which requires that accessibility requirements are met for all electronic and IT requirements purchased by federal government in the US. And this is a really big thing. This really put accessibility on the map and made people really look at accessibility requirements. So this is really important. Now, in 1998, they started working on WCAG 1, and a year later, those who worked with the W3C, things seem to work a lot slower now. WCAG 1, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1, was released. Now, it was released in 1999. It consisted of 14 guidelines with 65 checkpoints, and it was seen to be too complex. But of course, WCAG 2 was a little bit more complex than that. And it was not technology independent. So it mentioned things like server maps and not having click here links and things like that. So it was much more specific than WCAG 2. And it was something that we used for many, many years. The important thing that really happened that put accessibility on the map was the first accessibility litigation, which actually happened in Australia, and that happened 1999 to 2000. Basically, Bruce Maguire, who was a vision impaired user, wanted to buy tickets to the Sydney Olympic Games, which was in Australia in 2000. And in 1999, he attempted to buy the tickets, and he was using a screen reader, and he couldn't purchase the tickets for a number of reasons. Firstly, they used JavaScript for navigation. They used screenshots of tables of results instead of coded tables. And even though Bruce made a complaint the Sydney Operating Commission did ignore Bruce Maguire. So he went to the Human Rights Commission in Australia and made a complaint. And SOCOG, which is Sydney Operating Commission of the Olympic Games, ignored the human rights. And so it ended up in court. So that was a really big deal. And the argument for the developers of the Sydney Olympics Games was that it would cost $16 million to make the site accessible. And the judge thought that was ridiculous, decided that it would only cost $10,000 to make the site accessible. And so he doubled that amount when assigning a fine. So he fined SOCOG $20,000, but he also awarded attorney's fees to Maguire and Herriot. And those attorney fees for Maguire was over $500,000. And SOCOG did bring people in from the US to argue their case. So their attorney fees would have been quite high. And I was in accessibility at the time. I'd started a couple of years before. And I remember thinking, oh, $16.5 million to make something accessible. Wow, I'm going to make lots of money, but I'm not in it for the money, just in case you don't get my sarcasm. But it was an interesting time. It hit the front page of every newspaper in Australia, and it really put accessibility on the map, especially in Australia. And around that time, I joined the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and I was with them from 2000 to 2006, I believe. And that was, a lot of work, and worked with some great people over those years. So in 2006, we had the first public draft of WCAG 2 released. And for those who weren't in the industry back then, it was quite controversial. So there was this criteria called testability, which required that everything that is in WCAG 2 needed to be what we call quote unquote testable. And that meant that 8 out of 10 human testers would agree on the outcome, or that you could get an automated testing tool to test the requirement. And I actually wrote an article for a list apart arguing that testability, I think I called it testability costs too much. And I argued that it was basically impossible to get accessibility specialists to agree on anything. My example was, say, an alt attribute. We could definitely all agree that perhaps an alt attribute was incorrect, but not necessarily that an alt attribute was correct. And so I had some examples there. That was also around the time that Lisa Seaman, who is an expert in cognitive disability requirements, lodged a formal objection, which was signed by about 100 people, and I was one of those people. And that was basically a formal objection that said that WCAG didn't address the needs of people with cognitive disabilities enough. And so as a result of that, WCAG 2 was kind of pulled from public release and worked on for a couple more years. Now, that was the time that I actually left the WCAG working group, and I started working with Joe Clark, who was very big in the accessibility community at the time. And we worked on something called the WCAG Samurai Errata. And what we argued was that instead of having WCAG 2, that we needed to have basically a revised WCAG 1, which is what the WCAG Samurai Errata were. And so that was basically a bit of an argument in the industry at the time, whether you used WCAG 1. WCAG 2 was published in 2008. And I actually published a blog post that said, this is why I'm still using WCAG 1. And after a couple of years, I came around to believing in WCAG 2 and sort of seeing that there was enough support and techniques and explanations there to, support the use of WCAG 2. But WCAG 2 was very complex compared to WCAG 1, and it did cause a lot of ruction within the accessibility industry. So the next big thing that happened was 2008, Target in the US was sued by the National Federation for the Blind. Now, they argued that a lack of alt text meant that people with vision impairments couldn't purchase online, that online purchases required a mouse, that they had inaccessible image maps. Remember image maps? And they had actually been making complaints about the Target websites since 2005, so for 3 years, and they eventually went to court. The judge found that even though the site was not connected to a single physical place, they were connected enough to be included under the accommodations requirements. So that was a really interesting decision, and it meant that there became a lot more lawsuits in the area. The other thing that was really interesting about this is that they settled out of court. So they didn't actually wait for a judge to award settlements. They settled for damages of $6 million, which is a huge amount of money if you think about it. And NFB were awarded attorney costs, which were in they were about $3.5 million. So we're talking about a lot of money. And at that point, there was a flurry of work in the accessibility industry, as there was around 2000 as well, because people didn't want to have to pay that much in terms of damages. So the next big lawsuit was in 2012 against Netflix. They were sued by the National Association for the Deaf for not having captioning. Now, this was the first time a company in the US was sued that didn't have an actual public location. And Netflix argued a number of reasons why they didn't need to meet accessibility requirements. One, they didn't have a public location, so the act wasn't applicable to them. They also argued that if they provided captions to video, even video that had captions previously, they would actually be in copyright violation of all the TV shows and movies that they had access to. The judge did not agree with them and awarded $795,000 in damages. Now, they also required that Netflix have captions for all their content within 2 years, so by 2014. And they did meet that requirement, which was great. The other thing that was interesting about Netflix is in 2015, they released a TV show that they had created themselves called Daredevil, which was about a blind superhero that went around fighting crime in New York. Now, just like captions are needed for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, audio descriptions are needed for people who are vision impaired or low vision. And a blind superhero might be of interest to people who are vision impaired. But when they released the TV show All at Once in 2015, it did not have audio descriptions. And that there was a bit of a furor in the accessibility industry at the time about how dare they do this. And now Netflix did release audio descriptions within 3 days, so it may just have been a scheduling issue. And they are really, really good audio descriptions, so definitely worth looking up if you can find them. For the Australians in the audience, I saw that we had some Australians. You're up rather early. In 2014, Coles, which is for the Americans a bit like a Trader Joe's, the Coles was sued for having an inaccessible website. Now, the interesting part about that is that they'd actually worked with a vision impaired person for several years to make their site accessible. And it was, and someone who was vision impaired could purchase things online and things like that. But then mid-2014, they released a new system, and that system was not accessible. And this coincided with the retrenchment of the Disability Discrimination Commissioner in the Australian Human Rights Commission by the Liberal large L, so our Conservative government in 2014. And so the woman that had been complaining found that she basically had no recourse. Coles were no longer taking her calls. She didn't have, an advocate. And so she went to the next avenue, which was to actually sue Coles. Now, it was settled out of court. We don't know for how much. Laws are a little bit different in Australia than they are in the US, but it's generally assumed it was in the $500,000, $250,000 mark. So that also created sort of interest in accessibility in Australia. And then the next thing that happened was EN 301549, which is around 2013 and 14, which is basically where the European Union required that public procurement of all EU ICT products and services needed to be accessible. So basically the equivalent of Section 508, which basically made accessibility a bigger thing in Europe. Then we had in 2014, I actually spoke at the design of the web, I think future design of the web, something like that, in New York about mobile accessibility. And it was it was starting to be a big thing. We really knew that WCAG 2 wasn't enough in terms of mobile accessibility. And so in 2014, the BBC released their mobile accessibility guidelines, and they were basically seen as the de facto standard for mobile accessibility requirements for several years. There are a couple of problems with them, though. One, they merged mobile app and mobile site requirements. And so often when you're working on an app, the code is completely different, etc. This is long before React, where you could output a site and an app at the same time. And the other thing is, a few years down the track, the BBC came out after a lot of, I suppose, complaints about how they didn't address certain requirements, and said, hey, look, we never expected that these guidelines would be seen as the de facto standards. We wrote them for ourselves. We're a public broadcaster. We have very different requirements to, say, an Amazon or an eBay, and we really don't think that our guidelines should be used by everyone. But it was definitely something that a whole lot of people used for several years. 2018, WCAG 2.1 was released, which had been worked on for several years. There had been a decision in the working group that WCAG 3 was going to take a lot longer to write, and that they really needed to address the requirements that had been missed or the things that had changed. The big things that were addressed were issues around people with cognitive disabilities and people with low vision, and of course mobile requirements. So coming back to WCAG 2 success criteria are definitely applicable to mobile. However, not all aspects of mobile accessibility are specifically covered by WCAG 2. So for example, WCAG 2 requires that sites be accessible to the keyboard. However, it doesn't require that sites are accessible to the touch screen. And so 2.1 included things like touch target size and things like that. A lot of the cognitive disability requirements were relegated to level AAA, which was a pity. Now, in 2017, so prior to the release of 2.1, I attended the ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium, and we had what we called a town hall at the end of this conference. Now, this is a very unique conference in that it's aimed at accessibility testing specialists, not at people who, say, developers or things like that. And at the end of each conference, we have this town hall where we talk about what the community needs, what is missing. And at the end of 2017, basically the overwhelming argument was that there were no specific mobile guidelines. All the big accessibility companies had their own mobile accessibility guidelines, and they weren't consistent with each other, and that was a real problem. So a group of the testing specialists got together from all the big companies, Level Access, TPG, from us, etc. And we basically amalgamated all of our mobile testing methodologies into what we called the first IC mobile testing methodology. And so we worked on that for a year to put them all together into a format that would make sense. And it was released in October 2018, a few months after 2.1 was released. Now, we really hoped that 2.1 would be released and that would fully address the requirements of mobile, and that we wouldn't need to do any further work. However, even though WCAG 2.1 does address more requirements regarding, say, touch screens, etc., and small screen devices, it was a decision in the next ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium that it didn't go far enough. And the one thing that we can indicate with that is that touch target size requirements. So basically the requirement that an actionable item on a mobile device, is a specific size. So, it's not so small that you can't tap on it, is a AAA requirement. And in general, us accessibility specialists know that guidelines go to AAA to die, if that makes sense. A lot of AAA requirements don't get met. And so we decided to reform the committee, and we basically started again. We started with the amalgamation of the requirements, but then we built on them. And what we did is we added WCAG 2.1 requirements, and we added some AAA things that we thought were really important for accessibility. And we basically developed them and we released them in 2019. So once again, we worked with, that was something that the entire accessibility industry was involved in, and it's something that we are reforming the committee this year. So if it's something you're interested in, we'd be really happy to have you involved. Now, I hadn't set this up, but I'm just going to show you where this is. Okay, so this is the AccessibilityOz website. Under resources, there is a section called mobile testing. And here it's got a whole lot of information, and we split up the requirements into mobile site testing and native app testing. And so you've got the actual methodology, so basically the requirements or the success criteria. Then you've got the section about mobile site testing. So, how to choose devices or assistive technologies, site types. Are we talking about M.dot sites or responsive sites? What do you do if you've got variations of a page, say different content served to browsers versus main sites, and how you capture errors. Then you have basically the critical test cases, the test cases and assistive technology test cases. And we have information about the requirement, information on how to test, and passes and fails. Now, if you want more information about that, I would definitely recommend going to resources and then webinars, and then looking at this first webinar, which is how to test the accessibility of your mobile website and apps. And that goes into it in a lot of detail in terms of how you use it, etc. So that's basically where accessibility has been. In terms of us, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about us. It is our 10th birthday after all. So this is our team a couple of years ago. So we are a small team. I have staff around the world. We have clients around the world as well. And when I started AccessibilityOz 10 years ago, I wanted to support people with disabilities by providing them with employment opportunities, as well as working in accessibility. And so about 60% of our staff have some kind of significant disability that affects their daily life. And you wouldn't necessarily know that to look at us. And that's something to remember, is that often people with disabilities are hidden in plain sight. But we've had people with dyslexia, moderate vision impairment, epilepsy, migraines, severe vision impairment, physical impairments, PTSD, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, and cerebral palsy. And the one thing that I always point out in my presentations is it's not just about vision impairments. Accessibility is much larger than that. And a lot of people who are new to accessibility talk about screen reader accessibility, and that is, of course, very important, but there's a lot more to it than that. And just a little bit about me. I started in the industry in 1998. I worked on the very first accessible website in Australia called Disability Information Victoria. And then I worked on the Vision Australia website. So for those who are aware of Vision Australia, I did work on their website very early on. In 2000, I created Australia's first automated accessibility testing tool called Purple Cop. For those who remember back then, there was the very first automated accessibility testing tool out there was called Bobby. It was based on an English copper. So that was my little riff on Bobby. And my company was called Purple Top. So that's why I called it that. I had a company, Purple Top, from 1998 to 2004. In 2000, I was an invited expert to the W3C WCAG2 working group. And in 2006, I worked on the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games. And they worked very hard to make sure that the thing that was the Sydney Olympics didn't happen again, and it didn't, which was great. Then I spent a few years managing usability and accessibility services at Monash University. So I'm very aware of what it's like to try and get accessibility in university. What I used to say is lots and lots and lots of websites and teeny tiny budgets. So I know that that can be very difficult. And, we just spent 5 years working with California Community Colleges Tech Centre, working on making their 114 California community colleges accessible. And then I founded AccessibilityOz in 2011, 10 years ago today. 2013, we released Oz Player, which is our accessible video player, in a response to We often did audits, and we would always find that the video players were inaccessible, often contained keyboard traps, and our clients would say, well, what are we supposed to do instead? What are we supposed to use? What's accessible? And we'd like, oh, there isn't much out there. So we built AusPlayer. 2013, we released AusArt, which is our automated accessibility testing tool. We actually had started building that on day one. However, we didn't release it commercially until 2013. 2015, something that I'm very proud about. I spoke at the United Nations on the importance of web accessibility. I talked about the massive fires that were in Victoria in Australia in 2009 and killed over 100 people, and something like 45, maybe 50% of the people who died were people with disabilities. And I talked about how it's really important with natural disasters that you provide accessible content. 2016, I was nominated for Australian of the Year. 2017 and 18 and 19, I was the chair of the ICT mobile site and native app testing committee working on the methodology. And last year, I'm really proud to say that I won the inaugural Accessibility Person of the Year. So that's me. About our products, as I said, we have AusArt and AusPlayer. AusWiki is our database of accessibility errors, screenshots, code, and solutions. And as an attendee of our presentations, you get 6 months access. We also have fact sheets, accessibility voices, and videos, which I'm going to show you very briefly. So these fact sheets, these were commissioned by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and basically it's on these different categories: images, PDF, video, interactive maps, HTML5, content, JavaScript, tables, coding, keyboard, source order, forms, and mobile. And so they have a section here on accessibility principles, why you should make page titles accessible or text content accessible, etc. The impact on users, what actually happens if these things are not accessible. We have what we call a manager checklist, which is basically a testing checklist, and a developer checklist, which has correct and incorrect examples. So you can see here the requirement A1, page title should be coded. The requirement is all pages must have a page title. The correct example is title, Bureau of Meteorology dash homepage, end title. Incorrect example is that no title is present. And so we also have these things called the CCC developer videos. And so we did these in conjunction with California Community College's Tech Center. So we have 16 videos on HTML, forms, and ARIA, and all of them are under 5 minutes, on things like creating HTML headings, keyboard focus, checkboxes and radio buttons, creating accessible error messages, how not to use ARIA, etc. Now, these and the fact sheets are all available under Creative Commons. And so that means that basically you can use these, put them on your website, repurpose them, as long as you attribute either CCC or the Bureau of Meteorology. You can do what you like. And so that's basically it for me. And now we get on to any questions. So please let me know if you have any questions starting about the presentation itself and if I got anything wrong. Excellent. Well, I obviously just stunned you with all the information in accessibility, and I do have to apologize that was my cat crying in the background. I don't have some baby that I'm just ignoring. I just have a cat that I'm just ignoring. He obviously wants to get fed. And so what I'm going to do now is start with the questions that came from the lists that we got sent. So the first question is, what's in store for the future? Oh, let me turn on my video. Yes, Bobby. Yes, Bobby. If you remember Bobby was pretty good. Bobby was great. And Melanie Thornton, I mean, yeah, we're all showing our age if we remember Bobby. But okay, so the question is, what's in store for the future? So I really think, and this kind of builds into the next question, is what about accessibility and new AI technology? Now, I think that really things will change a lot with AI. And when I say AI, I don't mean the real artificial intelligence where, uh, you know, uh, computers have consciences and things like that, but more kind of machine learning. But I do think it will make a big difference. But I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error. We all have seen some of the automated generated alt text. It's not great. It will get better. And I think also there has been a history of things that have been created for people with disabilities ending up in the mainstream. So, Siri is basically a continuation of a requirement of basically the YouTube captioning features, auto captioning features. And so it's the same kind of engine that worked on creating auto captioning for YouTube videos that then goes into our, Alexas and Siris and things like that. And it seems like there's a lot of things that were created initially for people with disabilities that end up in the mainstream. So I think that that's going to be really interesting. It might actually end up being the other way around now with, AI and people creating games and 3D spaces and things like that will end up being really interesting and really helpful for people with disabilities. So I'm excited for the future. I will say, though, that there's always been, in the 20 odd years that I've been doing this, there's always been a kind of period where people go, oh my gosh, accessibility, it's going to be like this big thing. And so it's sort of seen as, the next big thing. And I think that people are definitely talking about that way, about accessibility with COVID, right? Like, oh, everyone has to go online, work from home, et cetera. So therefore, everyone's going to care about accessibility, and people are going to put millions into it and address it the way that it needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, these things are often flashes in the pan. Every time there was a lawsuit, there'd be venture capital companies getting in. There'd be a lot of purchasing of different accessibility companies, and it just became this big thing. And then a year later, 2 years later, it was back to normal. So it's an interesting industry. It kind of has its ups and downs. And I do think that with AI, it will be something that it's unusual. We won't have seen it before. The next question I have is, when using ARIA label attributes on links that might say read more, is this enough for accessible links? There are a lot of people who would disagree with me. I personally don't think that that's enough. However, I do think it's better than not having ARIA label attributes on links. And sometimes you need to, decide what you're going to argue. And if it's going to be a lot of work to change those read more links, maybe that effort is better spent on some other area of accessibility. So the reason why I say ARIA label attributes aren't enough is because ARIA label attributes are absolutely fantastic for screen reader users and for, say, other assistive technology users, but they're not visible or accessible to people with cognitive disabilities. People with cognitive disabilities also find those read more links difficult to understand. So that's why, you will find that it's more accessible than not having the ARIA label attributes, but it's really not perfect. But then most things usually aren't. The next question I have is, my views on assistive technologies. Look, in all the work that I did with mobile, or that we're still doing with mobile, I'm absolutely stunned at the assistive technologies that are available on mobile devices and that keep changing. So we released the latest version of the testing methodology about a month or so before iOS 14 was released. And iOS 14 had some fantastic additions like dark mode that really are really useful to people with disabilities. And I think that the thing is that there are a lot of people now who use assistive technologies without actually ever identifying themselves as a person with a disability. My stepmother, for example, uses increased text size on her iPhone, but she would never argue that she had low vision. She'd never think that she had low vision. And I think that these assistive technologies are just sort of part of life now. And, you know, they make the world more accessible to a whole lot of people who wouldn't necessarily consider that they would need an assistive technology. The next question is, how much of digital accessibility falls in the hands of designers versus developers? Look, I think a lot of it is developers. I think that there are some design requirements that you do need to be aware of. I do have some blog posts on design accessibility that you might be interested in, but a lot of it is developers. But having said that, there's a lot that developers won't be able to do if the designers haven't done it correctly. So I think it's a bit of both. Having said that, we run training for designers and we run training for developers. Our training for designers is half a day. Our training for developers is 4 days. So that's a fairly good indication of the difference between the two. Jeremy says, my iPhone has nearly all of the core accessibility software that our entire AT lab had in 1997. Yeah, that is absolutely mind-blowing, and that's true. So that's another thing to remember, is that often people with disabilities, they won't have a laptop anymore because their assistive technologies, you know, they are just built into an iPhone. If you're a screen reader user, why would you carry around a laptop? You can't, you know, see the screen. It's heavy and bulky. You know, why wouldn't you just use your iPhone? So be very aware of that. My next question is, how does WCAG handle digital math for Braille reading students? Now, I had to do some research here. And so there is the W3C Math Home. Let me share my screen. And they've just started basically they've just started a working group. So I'm going to put this in the chat. So there's definitely some stuff here that's worth looking at, because they are looking at MathML in more detail. But if you're looking at actual kind of technology to help students, there's some great things under Perkins. So I'm going to send that out too. And there's also some stuff here from the American Association of Blind Teachers around general resources for maths and science. So there's some fantastic things here. But basically, when it comes to WCAG, MathML was kind of the thing to use. And then for a couple of years, it was kind of fell out of favor. And then it kind of, you know, with the W3C sort of said MathML is the way to go. So there's definitely some stuff there to have a look at. And if you can't find it, just let me know. Now, I have another question that's rather technical, which is, what are MSAA hooks? Oh, I thought the question was, can you talk more about MSAA hooks? MSAA hooks are Microsoft Active Accessibility hooks, and they're basically ways that you hook in accessibility into desktop applications. There's a great website here that describes the hooks, which I'm going to put into the chat. And there's also a hooks overview under Microsoft Docs that will be helpful as well. And the last question that got sent in was, what are the best practices for alt text and captions when we're writing too much? Now, this just got sent in recently, so I haven't been able to actually look up the reference, but there's a fantastic document by GSA, I think, about the 28 types of alt attributes. So basically, the biggest thing that I can say about alt attributes and, you know, what you should write is that it is more of a science. Sorry, it is more of an art than a science. You don't want to put more information in the image. Sorry, you don't want to put more information in the alt attribute that is not in the image. But you don't really need to go overboard. Now, there is a lot of kind of discussion around this. I did some training for people with disabilities who were editing websites. And so I had about 5 or 6 people who were vision impaired who were in the class. And some of them wanted really detailed alt attributes, you know, the color of people's hair, you know, what they were wearing, you know, that kind of stuff. And then others were like, no, don't want anything at all, just give me an empty alt attribute. So my best recommendation for this is make sure it's consistent across your website. So choose a sort of level of verbosity and stick with it across your website. Now, one thing I will say is alt text are very different to captions. So a caption is something that can be seen by everyone in addition to the image, whereas alt text is a description of the image. You never want the alt text and the caption to be the same. So the caption might be the name of people, and the alt attribute might be a description of them. But the best way to really decide how to write alt text is to think about what the function of the image is. So if the function of the image is a link to the homepage, then, you know, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. You need to just tell the user that it's a homepage, and you don't need to say that it's a link because the screen reader user will say that. If the image is a little arrow, but the function is a link to the next page, then the alt attribute shouldn't be arrow, it should be next page. Now, the one exception for this is when you have alt attributes for image galleries. And yes, you must have alt attributes for image galleries. If you have an image gallery as, say, butterflies, then, you know, you don't want to have alt attribute of butterfly, butterfly, butterfly. And the caption is usually the name of the butterfly. So you don't want to put the alt attribute as the name. So in that case, you might want to describe, well, you will want to describe it in detail. So, you know, red and black butterfly with brown spots, that kind of stuff. So yeah, have a look for that GSA alt attribute website, and if you can't find it, reach out and I'll send it out. Okay, so we've got a couple questions on chat and on Q&A. So Anna, great to see you. And thanks for attending the presentation. Additional perspectives on the future of accessibility related to online learning, LMS platforms and e-tools. I think we're going to see a whole range of changes to online learning. I think we'll probably see a lot of gamification. If anyone remembers Google Wave, I think it was called Wave, where Google had kind of like a whole bunch of different things partnered together. And when I was at Monash, we actually looked at it. It was a chat system, it was a docs system, etc. I think we're going to see, oh yes, it was Wave. Thank you, Laura. I think we're going to see a lot more like that. And the problem is, of course, whenever there's kind of like a, increase in technology, the accessibility always takes a little while to catch up. So I think that there will be a real increase in technology and accessibility will kind of fall by the wayside. And then I think there'll be another, maybe another big lawsuit and, things will change. People go, oh my gosh, we need to worry about accessibility. And then people will say, oh, accessibility is the next big thing. And, everyone will get on the accessibility bandwagon for a couple of years and then we'll just go around in circles. I think that it's going to be an interesting time, but I think that with COVID, a lot of people are spending a lot more time thinking about online. And Laura, thank you. Great session. I could listen to you all day. Oh, thank you. I think that there'll be a kind of increase and we'll see, accessibility eventually catch up. Rob Harvey maybe out of scope, have you seen anything more in recent to add on the capture debate? Yeah, and the working group, of 20 years ago, released a document that said captures are not accessible. But there was a discussion, I was in the discussion, I didn't agree with it, about how we had to allow captures in WCAG 2, because I wanted to make them just, you know, if you have a capture, you can't make WCAG 2. But the argument was that if we allowed captures, sorry, if we didn't allow captures in WCAG 2, then clients or people who use captures would then go, oh, well, we can't be accessible. We're not going to address anything at all. Now, captures are notoriously inaccessible. They're still inaccessible. Where every 6 months or so, we test Google reCAPTCHA because that's the thing that's closest to accessible. And it's actually less accessible than it was about 18 months ago. The audio version of the reCAPTCHA doesn't work. It's fantastic. It's fantastic to sort of, if you get that little thing that you tick and say, hey, I'm not a robot, and it goes, oh, hey, you're not a robot, that's great. But anyone who uses an assistive technology like a screen reader is going to trigger the actual capture itself, and that capture is completely inaccessible. And I have tested a lot of captures, and captures are never accessible. I have never come across an accessible capture. There are some things that you can do instead, human test questions, but really you need to do server-side validation to catch spam things. That's what you need to do. So yeah, definitely captures are problematic. There is actually another document that the working group wrote on capture accessibility a couple of years back, maybe even a year back. So we'll put that out as well. I'll find that and send that out as well. Okay, Laura, how is the approach in WCAG 3 different from 2.0 and 2.1? It's very, 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 did I mention very, very different. So there has been a lot of argument around, you know, the whole kind of black and white perspective of WCAG 2. You know, you either pass or you fail. What if you kind of like, you know, like the ARIA label attributes, you know, you kind of, it's not perfect, but it's not a fail, but, well, it kind of is a fail, but it's not really a pass, and it kind of is a pass. So WCAG 3 has basically a scoring system, which is kind of like if you meet this requirement, you get 1 point. If you meet that requirement, you get 2 points, etc. I personally, I haven't had anything to do with writing it. I personally think that it's overly complex. However, we are on really early stages of WCAG 3. There's, I'd say, at least 5 years before we end up seeing it as an actual recommendation. So I think that there'll probably be a whole lot of changes before we get to it. But I think at the moment, it's problematic. I think they might be looking at it from a kind of automated tool perspective, in that you kind of automate these kind of things. But yeah, I think that, yeah, it will be very different. So definitely look at 2 and 2.1. 3 is still a while away. I have a question here from Carol. I came in late, so if you talked about it, please skip this question. What motivated you to start in the field of accessibility? I actually didn't answer that question. I used to say, probably up until about 5 years ago, I used to say, I actually started in 97 working for an IT firm that wrote documentation for Windows applications. And then they spun off a company that built websites, because this is really, really early on. You know, these were like the first websites ever built, you know, for government departments and things like that. And you know, we won a contract for Disability Information Victoria, and I was kind of the girl Friday, and they were like, we're like, well, blind people can't use websites. And they're like, well, actually they can. And I was given the task to figure out what that meant. Because this is before WCAG. It was, there used to be emails that would go out saying these are all the new websites that have been released this week. So it was a long time ago. So that's how I started professionally. But actually, so that's the story I always used to tell. And it was really important to me. I just always saw it as something that it was really something that you had to do. I didn't understand why people didn't do it. And then probably about 5 years ago, I was watching TV at 2 a.m. in the morning, and this TV show called Press Gang came on. And I remembered it because I absolutely loved Press Gang. When I was at school, it was about a Canadian school, I think, and about, newspaper people in Canadian school. And one of the minor characters was quadriplegic, and they used the sit puff machine. And I remember, like, it all came back to me. That was my first real, time that I'd seen someone with a disability, a significant disability, in media. And I went through the things that most people go through, like, what is that person doing? Why should they're going to take longer doing things, why should we, give them accommodations, to just seeing them as a normal person. And so when I got involved in accessibility a few years later, it was natural to me that someone with a disability would want to access all this content and would want to do so easily. So that's how I got into accessibility. Anna has asked, are mobile devices highlighted, recognised with the body in Australia or in the world as an assistive technology somewhere? In education, they are blanket banned. Wow. Oh, yes, of course they are. And I was thinking, really? But I'm thinking schools, yes, of course. And if they hold all accessibility software since 1997, it seems a no-brainer for it to be recognised somewhere for people. Yeah, look, that is a really good point. I don't know the answer to that, but you are correct. Like, I think that there will be occasions where it makes a whole lot of sense for a person with a disability to have access to a mobile device to access the content, because they can't see the board, or, their laptop doesn't have the right assistive technology or something like that. So I will have a look into that and let you know. So I'm not sure what Jeremy says means, new releases plus links plus JAWS, but I'm sure it's good. So I think that we're going well on time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sticking around and listening to me talk. I do love accessibility, and I'm really happy that we've made it this far. And I want to say, I know I'm the face of accessibility, but AccessibilityOz, not accessibility, the face of AccessibilityOz, but I wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for the fantastic staff that I've had over the years. So I want to thank them, and also the fantastic clients that we've had. And we do really want to help people, support people when they're, investigating accessibility and looking into it. And we know that a lot of you don't have a whole lot of, money to deal with these things. And that's why we have things like OzWiki and the fact sheets and stuff like that. So, we do really try and, work with you in that way. So please keep in touch. We'll hopefully be doing something like this 10 years from now, in which we'll be saying, hey, we don't need to do anything. We're all sitting on an island because everything's accessible. And yes, I will share the slides. We'll send out a link to everyone who's registered with a recording, and the links that I've mentioned here in the chat, as well as the additional things that I said I would send out. So Paul, if you want to mention anything in the chat, you're welcome. So thank you very much. Anyone else have any further questions before we get going? And if you really want to, you can hear me talk about this again in, well, it's how many hours? 6 hours. So, and then that one, it will be a little bit more Australia focused. Yes, and yes, I wish I could send you all a mug, but yes, I think that with the Australian postal system, USPS, and the breakability of the mugs, probably not a good idea. But yes, we'll see what we can do. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you all soon.